She was once a hero on the battlefield, until they blinded her and left her to die. But in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, a broken soldier hears her cry, and what he finds will change his life forever. This is not just a story about rescue. It's about loyalty, redemption, and a love that never needed eyes to see. Jonas Weller had stopped expecting visitors, man or beast, a long time ago. He lived at the edge of Riverside Grove, a modest suburb nestled just beyond the bustling heart of Columbus, Ohio. His house stood alone at the end of Alderwood Lane, a single-story ranch-style home with faded cream siding, an overgrown backyard, and a garden that hadn't known a flower since his wife passed. The paint on the shutters peeled quietly in the wind. The wooden fence sagged in some places, stubborn in others. The house was still, but not dead. It waited. Jonas was 47 years old, with a square jaw softened by years of silence, and eyes like ash, gray and exhausted. His shoulders, once broad with military pride, sloped now under the weight of memory. Most days he wore the same uniform, dark jeans stained with old oil, a navy thermal shirt with a hole under the left arm, and boots that once stomped desert sand. His hair had receded enough to reveal the shape of his thoughts. He moved with a quiet precision, a leftover rhythm from years of following orders. He mowed the lawn. He trimmed the hedge. He fixed what broke. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was usually to himself. His wife, Elise, had died of ovarian cancer 3 winters ago. She had been tall, willowy, a woman who wore kindness like perfume and loved her garden more than herself. Losing her had scraped Jonas clean. After she passed, he closed the shutters, stopped listening to music, and spent his evenings tinkering in the garage with old engines and rusted metal that didn't ask anything of him. He didn't hate the world. He just no longer believed it had anything left to say to him. That belief ended the night he heard the cry. It was nearly midnight. Jonas was in the kitchen, finishing off a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold when the sound cut through the quiet. A low, cracked howl, half sob, half surrender. It rose from the backyard like something from a war dream. He stood still, mug in hand, the sound tightening something deep in his chest. He waited, thinking it might have been a fox, maybe a raccoon caught in something. But it came again, longer this time, rawer. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. It was thick, military issue, patched at the elbow, the last thing Elise ever sewed for him. The backyard was blanketed in a thin crust of snow, the moonlight turning it into a sheet of silver. Wind moved gently through the bare trees. The cry came again, now softer, like something was giving up. He followed the sound past the garden bed, through the open gate, and toward the cluster of overgrown shrubs near the fence line. He didn't bring a flashlight. He didn't need one. And there, curled into the hollowed earth, was the shape of something breathing. A dog. She was large, unmistakably German shepherd, though her body had withered to near collapse. Her ribs pushed out like fingers from beneath thin fur, caked with mud and old blood. Her ears were ragged, one torn at the tip, and her legs trembled involuntarily as she tried to shield something behind her. Jonas crouched down slowly. "Easy, girl," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't snarl, didn't move, but her head turned blindly, nose twitching as she tried to place him in the dark. That was when Jonas saw her eyes, clouded completely white, empty of recognition or light. She was blind. And then, behind her, a flicker of movement, a tiny whimper. Puppies. 5 of them. So small they looked like crumpled socks pressed against their mother's belly. One tried to lift its head and failed, collapsing into its sibling. Jonas reached out a hand and the mother tensed, her breath catching like a loaded gun. But she didn't bite. She didn't growl. She just lay there, trembling, as if she had already made peace with whatever came next. "Jesus," Jonas whispered, blinking hard. "How the hell did you get here?" The answer didn't come, of course, but the urgency did. The night was cold, frigid enough to kill anything too small or too starved. The mother wouldn't last much longer. Neither would her pups. Jonas took off his coat and laid it gently on the ground. One by one, he slid the puppies into the warmth of the fabric, careful not to pull them too far from her. Then, gingerly, he placed an arm under her midsection. She was lighter than she looked, all bone and breath. As he lifted her, She let out a sound so soft it felt like apology. Back in the house, Jonas spread a blanket beside the heater and placed her there, arranging the pups at her belly. He brought a bowl of water, warm and clean, and a can of tuna, the only soft food he had in the pantry. She drank, not like a dog, but like a soldier after a long march. For the first time in years, Jonas didn't return to the garage. He sat on the kitchen floor, watching her breathe. The pups squeaked and wriggled. One opened its mouth in a silent yawn. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from, but something in her silence spoke to his own. The next morning, he called the local vet. Dr. Sarah Bellamy, a tall, lean woman in her early 50s with kind hands and a mouth that never quite smiled, arrived by noon. She wore jeans tucked into brown boots and a long canvas coat with pens in every pocket. She'd been through divorce twice and lost her own German Shepherd in a car accident 5 years ago, a grief that had hollowed her in quiet ways. Since then, she'd become fiercely practical with animals and gently distant with people. Sarah knelt beside the dog. She's blind, she confirmed. Old scarring, chemical exposure maybe. She's underweight, barely survived the birth. She inspected the puppies. They're fighters. Might just make it. Jonas folded his arms. She didn't growl, not once, even when I picked her up. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes softening. That's not fear, that's trust. When Sarah left, she gave Jonas a list of things he needed. Puppy milk formula, blankets, syringes, patience. He went out that afternoon and bought them all. That night, the house breathed with new life. The pups stirred in their sleep. The mother dozed in warm silence. And Jonas sat in the armchair Elise used to read in, watching shadows dance across the floor. He still didn't know what had brought the dog to his yard. But as he watched her ears twitch in sleep, her body curled protectively around the pups, and the tiniest of them nuzzle into her neck, he realized something. Maybe it wasn't him who rescued them. Maybe they had come to rescue him. It wasn't until the third day that Jonas gave her a name. He had watched her closely since bringing her and her pups into his home. She was cautious, yes, but not broken. She moved slowly, stiff from old injuries, and her blindness meant every step was taken with care. Yet there was a quiet dignity to her, something unspoken. She didn't beg. She didn't flinch. She didn't whimper unless one of her pups strayed too far. She simply endured, like someone who had known too much pain to waste time fearing the next wave. Jonas sat on the floor across from her, the pups nestled in a cardboard box lined with blankets beside the fireplace. He took a slow sip from his coffee and murmured, "You're not just any stray, are you?" The dog lifted her head, ears flicking toward him. She didn't bark. She never barked. He set his mug down and leaned forward. "You're a survivor, a fighter." He paused, studying her strong jawline, the stiff set of her shoulders. "You're Freya." He didn't know why that name came. Perhaps it was the faded copy of a Norse mythology book Elise had left on the nightstand, its pages warped from steam and grief. Freya, the goddess of war and love, protector and destroyer, a mother. It fit. Jonas said the name again, softly. Freya. This time her head turned toward him completely, nose twitching, and he could have sworn her tail moved. The name stuck. That afternoon, while the pups slept and Freya dozed in her blanket nest, Jonas pulled out his old laptop, blew off the dust, and began searching. Something in the way she moved had sparked a memory, not a specific face, but a presence. He'd served with K 9 units before. He'd seen dogs like Freya scale walls under gunfire and drag wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles. Some of them were decorated more than the men they fought beside. He typed, German Shepherd, female, retired military dog, blind. The results were overwhelming, and for a while it felt like chasing shadows. But then, tucked deep in an old military blog post from 4 years ago, he saw a photo. It was grainy and poorly lit, taken during a sandstorm, but the outline was unmistakable. Unit K 9147 Freya, German Shepherd, Afghanistan, chemical exposure, presumed retired. Jonas stared at the image. Her stance was rigid, even in the blur. Her handler, a young man named Corporal Dennis Morales, stood beside her. Jonas remembered him vaguely. Stationed near the green zone. Quiet kid. Good with dogs. According to the blog, Freya had saved 5 soldiers from a roadside bombing by detecting the IED early. but in the chaos of the evacuation, she had been exposed to white phosphorus, resulting in full corneal damage. The military had classified her as unfit for future service. He kept reading. A few months after her injury, she was discharged from service and transferred to a civilian training shelter. But after that, records stopped. No adoption listed, no sanctuary registration. Just gone. Jonas closed the laptop. The room felt suddenly colder, though the fire still glowed. He looked at Freya, now curled around her pups. Her breathing was slow but even. She had once been trained to protect men like him, and they had discarded her when she could no longer serve. He whispered, "They left you behind." The next morning, Dr. Sarah Bellamy returned for a follow-up. She had a brisk, purposeful stride and a face carved by years of dealing with other people's panic. Her ponytail was streaked with gray, but her hands were steady. Jonas noticed that she always touched the dogs first, before speaking to people. "She's drinking more water," Jonas noted as Sarah crouched beside Freya. "She's responding to care," Sarah replied, checking Freya's pulse, which says a lot. Most abandoned dogs either go feral or give up. She didn't do either. Sarah looked up, her eyes briefly catching the dim sadness still etched in Jonas's features. "Some dogs are made of sterner stuff." She examined Freya's scarred ears and tapped her stethoscope lightly against the dog's chest. "Did you know she's a vet dog?" Jonas raised a brow. "I had a hunch," Sarah nodded. "There's a rhythm to the way she holds herself. Discipline doesn't just vanish. I've seen this before. They get injured, declared surplus, shipped off to recovery facilities and sold to the highest bidder." Jonas felt the weight in her voice, something personal. He knew better than to ask. Sarah didn't elaborate, but her tone lingered like a storm cloud. After she left, Jonas found himself watching Freya with new eyes. She had once known structure, command, danger. Now, she navigated the world by smell, by instinct, by love. That night, while cleaning out the garage, Jonas came across a battered duffel bag, one he hadn't touched since his final deployment. Inside, under layers of gear and forgotten patches, was a worn dog harness, stitched with dirt and time. He didn't remember keeping it. Maybe Elise had. He ran his fingers over the faded lettering. Unit 72B, Service K9. He brought it inside. Freya sniffed it immediately, tail moving once, tentatively. Jonas placed it beside her. She lay her head across it and fell asleep. The next day, Jonas began small routines, feeding times at regular intervals, a gentle chime when he entered the room, commands spoken in a calm voice. He didn't want to retrain her, just restore her dignity. In the evening, he sat on the porch steps, coffee in hand, the pups squeaking somewhere inside. Snow flurries dusted the neighborhood, and distant laughter echoed from the front yard of a nearby house, where kids played in the cold. Life went on. Jonas stared up at the wide Ohio sky, dark and endless. He hadn't prayed in years, but he found himself murmuring, "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with all this." Behind him, Freya settled beside the screen door, her form like a statue, not demanding, not afraid, just present. He wondered again how far she had traveled to end up in his backyard. Had she escaped? Been abandoned again? Sold and discarded like a tool? It was a question without answer, but the silence seemed to whisper another. Why here? Why this house in this city? Why Columbus, Ohio? As he stood and walked back inside, he noticed something etched into the bottom of the old harness, barely visible, worn down by time and use. C72 RGLA. He traced the letters with his thumb. The first part he understood. C for combat, 72 for the unit. But the last part, RGLA, he made a mental note to ask Sarah. Something about it felt like a clue, or maybe just the beginning of something buried. That night, Jonas fell asleep in the armchair again, a blanket across his knees, the smell of puppies in the air, and the steady, quiet breathing of a dog who had seen too much and still chose to stay. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds in soft streaks of gold. Jonas Weller stood at the counter stirring warm formula in a chipped mug, the kind Elise used to drink her chamomile tea from. It had a faded sunflower on the side and a small crack near the handle he never had the heart to fix. The house, once sterile and still, was now alive with movement, little squeaks, occasional yips, and the rhythmic suckling of tiny mouths nursing from their mother. The puppies were growing, almost visibly so. It had been 2 weeks since Jonas found them in the cold, huddled against Freya's frail body. They were now stronger, their bellies rounder, their fur fluffing out in little patches of pale gold and cream. Their eyes had just begun to open, milky, unsure, and wide. Jonas sat cross-legged on the living room rug, pen in hand, notebook on his lap. A new habit, a journal. Day 13. Freya stood today, only for a few seconds. She sniffed her way to the water bowl without help. The smallest pup, Flint, is still weak, but tries hard to keep up. He gets knocked over a lot, but he's feisty. Reminds me of Corporal Jameson. He paused, chuckling softly to himself, then looked down at the litter beside Freya and started listing names. His names for them. The boldest of them, the first to walk and bark, was Nova, a female, fluffiest of the group, already trying to climb over the others. Her fur shimmered like dawn, and her little nose was always in the air. Next came Echo, a thoughtful male with wide, searching eyes. He didn't move much, but watched everything, often tilting his head as if puzzling out the world. Dusk was the darkest coated, quiet and slow, content to curl up near Freya and sleep long hours. Lumen, the smallest female, had a peculiar habit of wandering off toward corners, sniffing everything, curious to the point of worry. And finally, Flint, the runt. A trembling ball of fur with a lopsided gait and ears slightly too big for his head. Flint had trouble keeping up with his siblings. He would often get stuck behind furniture or knocked over during the feeding frenzy. But he was determined, and when he barked, it was sharp and full of fire. Freya watched them with a mother's patience. Blind but never unsure, she moved her head when they cried and nudged them gently back to her side. She cleaned their fur with practiced tenderness, responding instantly when one wandered too far. Jonas never stopped being amazed by her, how she mapped the room in her mind, how she never missed a step when it came to her pups. That afternoon, something changed. Jonas had left the baby gate open at the top of the stairs leading down to the basement. He'd gone into the garage to grab a box of old towels and returned to a sudden bark, sharp and panicked. It was Freya. He dropped the box, bolting inside. Flint had wandered near the stairs. His tiny paws had gotten too close to the edge, and he slipped, tumbling down the first step. Before Jonas could reach him, Freya was already moving. With a speed that defied the slowness of her usual movements, she lunged forward, her paws skimming the floor with terrifying precision. Blind eyes wide, she threw herself between Flint and the stairs, just as he slid again. Her body caught his, curled around him protectively, stopping his fall. Jonas froze. Freya didn't whimper. She didn't look back. She stayed still, her entire body trembling as Flint squeaked and wiggled in the warmth of her fur. Jonas rushed forward, lifting them both gently. Freya's heart pounded like a war drum. "Good girl," Jonas whispered, his throat tight. "You still got it, huh?" He sat with them on the rug, rubbing Flint's little head, then resting a hand on Freya's side. She leaned into his touch. Later that evening, after the pups had fallen asleep in a soft pile of warmth, Jonas found himself staring again at the old harness. The inscription inside still itched at his thoughts. C-72RGLA. The first part was clear. Combat Unit 72. But RGLA. He ran through possibilities in his mind. Military codes, rescue units, training centers, nothing stuck. So he did what he rarely did anymore. He reached out. He called a man he hadn't spoken to in years, Rick Calder, an old Army buddy now working in private security logistics out of San Diego. Rick was in his mid-50s now, rough around the edges, with a growl for a voice and a metal plate in his knee from a mortar incident. Jonas had once pulled him from a collapsed trench wall. They didn't talk often, but the bond between soldiers didn't require frequency, just need. RGLA, Rick muttered over the phone. Could be a location code. Let me check the old manifest archives. You still in Columbus? Yeah, Jonas said. Same house. All right. Give me a day. Maybe less. After the call, Jonas stepped onto the back porch, watching the city's silhouette shimmer beneath the sky. Riverside Grove was quiet, only the distant hum of tires on wet pavement, the occasional barking of a neighbor's dog. The maple tree in his yard had begun to bud early, despite the winter. A strange warmth lingered in the air. He found himself asking a question he couldn't quite explain. Why this city? Why Columbus? Why had Freya ended up here, blind and beaten, with 5 helpless lives depending on her? And why now, when Jonas himself had only recently begun to feel again? He thought of Elise. She used to say that life had a rhythm. It pulled things together at the moment they were most needed, whether they understood it or not. Back inside, he passed the hallway mirror and paused. His reflection startled him. There were softer lines in his face now, the deep creases near his mouth not as sharp. His eyes no longer looked like ashes. They looked like something that had caught light again. He returned to the living room, where Freya was curled up with her pups, her head resting lightly atop Nova's back. Jonas sat down beside them with his notebook. Day 14. Freya saved Flint today. She couldn't see the stairs, but she knew. Somehow she knew. I think she remembers more than I realize. Her training's still in there, somewhere deep. She's not just a dog. She's a guardian, maybe even a guide. He paused, the pen stilling on the paper. I used to think this house was a tomb. Now it's a nursery. Funny how fast the world can shift. Jonas closed the journal, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. The pups twitched in their sleep, dreaming of whatever it was puppies dream about. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing leaves against the windows. Somewhere, a siren cried and faded into the night. Jonas didn't know what the letters on the harness meant yet, but something told him it wasn't random. Nothing about this was. It started with a scratch. Jonas had been replacing the broken light on the side of the garage one crisp morning when he noticed the mark, thin, deliberate, and fresh, carved into the wooden siding beneath the gutter. It wasn't a splinter from wear and tear. It was too precise. 3 diagonal lines crossing through a circle, a symbol, intentional and foreign. He stared at it for a long while, brushing his fingers over the grooves. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been near his home. Someone who left messages instead of footprints. By the time he walked back into the house, his face had hardened. Not in fear, but in recognition. He'd seen that symbol before, not in Columbus, not in Riverside Grove, but years ago, in a war zone where no trees grew and the night sky never went quiet. A tag used by a radical cell, one that operated outside the bounds of nation or reason. The same group responsible for a botched extraction mission during Jonas's last deployment. A mission that had cost lives, blurred lines, and left one particular man unaccounted for. Jonas didn't say anything that night. Not to Sarah, who stopped by to check on the pups and stayed just long enough to pour herself a cup of coffee without asking. She had a way of sensing when not to push. But Freya noticed. She had been growing more alert in recent days, her ears always tuned, head tilting sharply at the smallest creak of a floorboard or shift in wind. Her blindness didn't dull her instincts. If anything, it sharpened them. That evening, as Jonas sat in the living room flipping through his old field journals, Freya sat beside him, rigid, still, and watching. The pups were growing fast now, especially Nova and Echo. Nova had begun responding to clicks and hand movements. Jonas had started incorporating small commands. Come, stay, sit, spoken softly and repeated with simple gestures. Echo, observant and quiet, seemed to understand faster than the others. He was always the first to obey, the first to look to Jonas when things changed. Flint, ever the smallest, struggled to keep up, but showed flashes of cleverness, like nudging a toy toward his siblings or hiding biscuits in the couch cushions. Jonas couldn't help but smile. Each pup was different, and each one carried a flicker of Freya's discipline. That weekend, Jonas began training again. Not for the pups this time, but for Freya. He laid out obstacles in the backyard, simple ones. Overturned buckets, foam poles, mats. With treats in one hand and soft praise in the other, he guided her. She moved with hesitation at first, but muscle memory returned in fragments. A tight turn here, a sudden crouch when she heard a certain whistle. She couldn't see the world, but she remembered how to work within it. It was like watching a ghost of her old self resurrect, one command at a time. On Sunday evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Riverside Grove, Jonas noticed another mark. This one was at the back fence, deeper than the first, angled differently. The same circle, same slashes, but beneath it, in the dirt, was something else. A small scrap of fabric. Camouflage, foreign made, fresh. Jonas felt the chill climb up his spine. The next morning he called Rick Calder again. "Tell me you found something," Jonas said, gripping the phone. Rick, still gruff but reliable, replied, "RGLA isn't a standard code, but I dug through old contractor records. RGLA was the call sign for a field outpost just north of Kandahar, abandoned after a chemical strike. But here's the thing. Freelance handlers operated there. Dogs were trained off record. If your Freya came from there, it means someone sold her." Jonas closed his eyes. Someone who wanted her to disappear. "Exactly," Rick said. "And if someone's tagging your house with old cell symbols, they're not there for the view." After hanging up, Jonas walked outside, scanning the yard, the line of trees at the back of the property. The woods beyond weren't dense, but deep enough to hide someone watching. He suddenly remembered something Elise once said. "You can't always see what's coming, but the trees do. They always know before you do." That night, he set up a trail cam near the fence line. He didn't expect much, just movement data, a vague shape, maybe a coyote. But what he saw the next morning on playback made his blood run cold. A man. Slim, tall, wrapped in dark clothing, face obscured, standing just beyond the trees at 3:14 a.m., hands in his pockets, looking toward the house. Still. Watching. Freya had growled that night. Jonas hadn't thought much of it, but she had known. The next day, Jonas brought one of the symbols into Sarah's clinic, sketched on a napkin. She looked at it, then at him. "You're not just worried about the dog anymore, are you?" "No," Jonas admitted. Sarah leaned against the counter. Her figure was tall, almost lanky. The long lines of her body always slightly hunched, as if carrying more than her own weight. She had a surgical precision in how she spoke. Short sentences, no indulgence in pleasantries. "When I was in vet school," she said slowly, "I worked with a K9 retirement unit out in Utah. Some of those dogs had been through more war than the people who handled them. Some came with scars, others with habits. But one thing was always the same. They were never just dogs." Jonas didn't speak. He didn't have to. Sarah set down the napkin. "If someone's looking for her, it's not because she's a pet. It's because she's evidence." Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees bent slightly, whispering secrets Jonas didn't want to hear yet. The streets of Riverside Grove stayed clean, the lawns trimmed, and the children rode their bikes without knowing that something darker was slinking through the edges of their world. Jonas returned home and reinforced the locks. He spent that evening walking the perimeter of his property with Freya beside him. Her tail was still. Her ears rotated constantly, following sounds he couldn't hear. Back inside, as the pup slept in a warm pile, Jonas picked up his journal. Day 21. Training is working. Freya remembers. So do I. But something's coming. The marks aren't random. The watcher isn't lost. This house, this city, Columbus, it's not coincidence. Someone chose this place. Or someone is still watching from the shadows of what we tried to forget. He closed the notebook slowly and looked down at Freya, who had positioned herself between the pups and the door. Silent, steady, and waiting. The snowfall came late that night, gentle at first, a slow curtain of white that blanketed Riverside Grove in silence. The kind of snow that made everything seem softer, cleaner, as if even the past could be buried beneath it. Jonas Weller stood at the back window, one hand gripping a warm mug of coffee, the other resting on the old wooden sill. The yard glowed faintly under the porch light. Everything peaceful, almost too peaceful. Freya lay beside him, ears tilted forward, body tense. The pup slept nearby, curled in a messy heap of fur and dreams, but Freya hadn't rested in hours. It had been 4 nights since Jonas had caught the figure in the trail cam, the Watcher. Since then, he'd barely slept, patrolling the perimeter, checking the locks twice, sometimes 3 times. He wasn't afraid exactly, but something primal stirred beneath his ribs, something he hadn't felt since Kandahar. And then it happened. A noise, sharp, close. Jonas heard it even before Freya reacted, the soft crack of a boot on snow. In one fluid motion, Freya surged up, teeth bared, the low rumble of her growl vibrating the floorboards. Jonas dropped the mug, glass shattering as he reached for the side drawer where he kept the Smith & Wesson .38, a habit from days long gone. He didn't grab it. He grabbed the flashlight instead, and the crowbar. By the time he stepped onto the porch, the night had stilled again, but Freya was gone, already a blur of motion heading toward the far edge of the backyard. Then came the scream. It was short and guttural, more shock than pain. Jonas sprinted after her, snow crunching under his boots, breath fogging the air. He reached the back fence in time to see a dark figure stumbling backward, clutching a bleeding arm. Freya stood in front of him, growling low, lips curled in fury. The man turned and ran, leaving a trail of crimson dripped across the snow. Jonas dropped beside Freya. Her body was shaking. Not from fear, but from restraint. She could have torn him apart. She had chosen not to. He whispered, "Good girl," running a hand along her back. Her fur was warm with sweat. Back inside, Jonas wrapped Freya in a towel, checked her for injuries. None. He calmed the pups, set them back into their box, then turned to the security system. The footage had caught it all. Motion from the tree line, a figure slipping through the fence, creeping low through the snow. Jonas paused the video and zoomed in. There, for a fraction of a second, the light from the house caught the man's face. A scar, running from his left brow down to the corner of his jaw. Faint, but unmistakable. Jonas had seen it before, years ago. The final mission. The chaos, the fire, the compound going up in smoke. The man who vanished just before extraction. His name had been Rashid Darzi, a liaison turned traitor, a ghost, last seen vanishing into the mountains of Helmand. No one had confirmed his death. Now he was in Jonas's backyard. Jonas picked up the phone. He didn't dial Sarah. He didn't call the local police. He called Mason Stroud. Mason was a former Delta operator, mid-40s, lean and wiry, with the posture of a man who could still sprint up a hill with 50 pounds of gear and not break a sweat. Jonas hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. Their last conversation had ended in silence, not anger, but the kind of silence that fills the space between men who've seen too much. When Mason answered, his voice was flat. "Didn't expect your name on my screen. I didn't expect a ghost in my yard." There was a pause. "You saw him?" "Darzi, or someone who looks too much like him to be anyone else." "Where?" "Columbus, Riverside Grove." "You sure?" "He bled. I have the trail." Another pause, then Mason's voice sharpened. "I'm coming." He arrived the next afternoon, driving a battered Chevy Suburban with out-of-state plates. Jonas met him on the porch. They didn't shake hands. They nodded. That was enough. Mason looked mostly the same, short-cropped blonde hair, eyes the color of river stone, a face weathered by wind and bad memory. He wore a brown parka, dark jeans, and carried a duffel that Jonas knew held more than socks. Inside, Mason crouched near Freya. "This her?" Jonas nodded. "Name's Freya. She's been through hell. She never left it." Mason scratched her behind the ears. Freya surprisingly didn't growl. She leaned slightly into the touch. Mason stood and walked to the window. "You ever think he'd come for you?" "No, I figured he was dead, or in hiding. Guess he figured you'd be easier to get to now." Jonas glanced toward the pups, then back at Mason. "I've got more to protect now." That night, they reviewed the footage again. Mason didn't speak much, but Jonas could feel his mind moving, connecting dots, planning. "This house," Mason said quietly. "It's not random. He's not here to tie up loose ends. He's here for something." "Freya?" "Could be, or whatever she remembers. Or maybe it's you, or both." Jonas sat heavily into the armchair. Why here? Why Columbus? It's not a battlefield. Mason didn't answer, but his silence felt like a warning. Outside, the snow began to fall again. In the corner of the room, Freya stood suddenly. Her ears twitched. She faced the window, body stiff. Jonas moved toward her. "What is it?" Then came the sound, a soft knock. Not on the front door, on the window. Jonas froze, so did Mason. The knock came again, then silence. Mason moved first, pulling a Glock from his coat. Jonas grabbed the crowbar again. They stepped toward the window together. Nothing. No one. Only a new mark, carved into the siding just beneath the frame. Another circle, this time with a new addition, an arrow, pointing east. Jonas and Mason stared at it. Freya growled low. Later, after double-locking every door and window, Jonas opened his notebook. Day 25, he's real, he's here, and he knows we're watching. I don't know if it's about Freya, or me, or something else. But this city, It was supposed to be quiet. Elise and I picked Columbus because it felt untouched, but maybe we were wrong. Maybe the ghosts found us anyway. He looked at the pups. Flint was curled into Freya's neck. Lumen twitched in sleep. Nova snored softly, a tiny warrior in waiting. Jonas closed the notebook. The war was returning. But this time, he wasn't alone. The frost hadn't yet melted from the grass when Jonas noticed Flint was gone. It was just after sunrise, the kind of morning where mist clung to the treetops like something afraid to let go. The puppies had taken to exploring the backyard in short, supervised bursts, darting between patches of dead leaves and the low garden fence. Flint, though smaller and slower than the others, was always the last to come back inside, always reluctant to leave the open air. But today, there was no bark, no patter of small paws against the porch, no excited squeal when Jonas called his name. Jonas stepped into the yard, barefoot and anxious. He scanned the ground. At first, nothing. Then, near the edge of the fence, he saw it, a half-eaten biscuit. Unusual. He hadn't put anything out that morning. Jonas crouched down. The biscuit looked familiar, but it had a powdery coating, faint but unnatural. He touched it, sniffed it. Bitter. Chemical. Beside it, he found paw prints, Flint's. Small, scattered, moving in a curved path. And then the other tracks, larger, deliberate. A man's boots. And something else. A long, shallow indentation in the snow, like something had been dragged. Jonas stood, his jaw clenched. He moved fast, back into the house, where Freya was already pacing in tight circles, nose to the floor. She knew. She had known before he did. The pups whimpered inside, huddled in the warmth of the blanket box. Jonas grabbed his gear, flashlight, knife, sidearm, and opened the cabinet by the stairs. Inside was a small tactical vest, dusty, but intact. He hadn't worn it in years. It still fit. Freya moved to the door before he did, waiting. They stepped into the woods. The trail was easy to follow, almost too easy. Broken branches, fresh prints, crumbs scattered every dozen feet. Jonas moved low, hand near the grip of his weapon. Freya followed at his side, alert, silent. Her blindness didn't hinder her. Her body remembered. As they moved deeper into the trees, the air grew colder. The woods behind Riverside Grove weren't particularly dense, but they were old. Twisting oaks and maples clawed toward the gray sky. Fog thickened around them. Jonas glanced back once. The houses had vanished behind the trees. After 20 minutes, they found it. A small cabin, hidden in a hollow surrounded by evergreens. The structure was rotted, roof sagging inward, windows boarded, but something was off. Too many footprints. No snow on the threshold. Smoke stains near the chimney that hadn't been there long. Jonas signaled to Freya. She stopped beside a log, ears up, body low. He stepped closer, pushing the door open with the toe of his boot. Inside, it smelled of damp wood, old ash, and something else. Dog. A metal cage stood in the corner. Inside, shivering and crying, was Flint. Jonas moved fast. "Easy, buddy, I got you." He knelt, checking the lock. Basic padlock. He pulled out the knife, started to work at the mechanism, and that's when the door slammed shut behind him. The sound of boots, 3 sets, moving across the wooden floor. He stood slowly, Flint still whimpering behind him, and turned. 3 men, all armed. One was tall, with a shaved head and a serpent tattoo curling down his neck. He held a knife loosely, as if he didn't need to try. The second was broader, with a long scar across his cheek and a slight limp. The third stood further back, partially in shadow. He wore a long coat, dust-covered, and a knit cap pulled low over his face. But when he spoke, Jonas recognized the voice. "Been a long time, Weller?" Jonas exhaled, steady. "Darzy." The man smiled, stepping into the light. Rashid Darzy had aged, but not softened. He had a narrow, angular face with dark eyes too calm for someone who once orchestrated a massacre. The scar was there, running from temple to jaw, faded, but not forgotten. He wore American jeans, a thermal shirt, boots, like a local, like he belonged here. "I didn't expect you to find me so easily," Jonas said. Darzy chuckled. "I didn't expect your dog to still be breathing." Jonas didn't look at Flint, didn't move. "What do you want?" "You have something that belongs to me. I don't have anything. Darcy nodded to the others. The tall one stepped closer, lifting his blade. Jonas drew his sidearm, fast and fluid. Try me, he said. Darcy raised his hand. Stop! The blade man froze. Darcy looked at Jonas, eyes narrowing. I'm not here to kill you, Weller. Not unless I have to. I want the dog, Freya. Jonas didn't respond. She remembers things. She saw things. Things they tried to bury with that outpost. I need her. Alive. Why? Because memory is power, and in the wrong hands, power keeps people quiet. Jonas looked past them. No windows, one exit. Maybe two if he could blow out the side wall. Freya. Where was Freya? As if summoned, a growl rose from the door. Low, deadly. Freya exploded through the half-broken wall to the side of the entrance, splinters flying. She struck the knife man first, straight into his side, knocking him down. He screamed, blade dropping. Jonas moved, gun up, and struck the second man with the butt of his pistol as he turned. Darcy stumbled back. Stop! She'll die for this! Jonas stood between Freya and the cage. She already almost did. Darcy reached into his coat. Jonas fired. One shot. Not to kill. The shoulder. Enough to drop him. He crumpled with a cry. The room was still. Jonas turned to Freya. She stood over the fallen attacker, not moving, not shaking, solid, guardian. He moved to the cage, broke the lock, and pulled Flint into his arms. The pup was shaking, but alive. Jonas stepped over Darcy, bleeding and gasping, and didn't say a word. Back at the house, Mason was waiting. He had seen the empty yard, the missing dog, and gone into alert mode. When Jonas appeared through the trees, blood on his sleeve, Flint in his coat, Freya limping slightly behind him, Mason just exhaled. Trouble? He asked. Jonas handed him Flint. The worst kind. They patched Freya's leg. It was bruised, not broken. Flint fell asleep immediately, tucked between a towel and Jonas's chest. That night, after the adrenaline wore off, Jonas stood at the window again. The trees swayed in the wind. Snow began to fall, delicate, uncaring. Day 26, Flint is home, Freya saved us. Again. The leader has returned. But it's not about revenge. It's about memory. Something she knows, something I forgot. Why did they want her erased? And why here? Why Columbus? This city? It was never random. He looked at Freya, lying between the pups, eyes closed but listening. The past was no longer distant. It had followed them home. The storm rolled in fast. It wasn't the kind of storm that carried thunder or rain, but the heavy, airless kind that presses down on your chest, a tension you can't quite name. The trees outside the cabin shivered under the wind, though the sky remained dry. Inside, the shadows were thick, holding their breath. Jonas Weller leaned against the cabin wall, breath ragged, one hand pressed hard against the wound in his shoulder. Blood seeped through his shirt, warm and insistent. The bullet had missed bone, but it had taken something more than just flesh. It had taken time, and Jonas knew he didn't have much of that left tonight. Darcy stood across the room, the pistol steady in his hand. His face was pale, not from fear, but from fury. His eyes burned with old vengeance, the kind that lived deep in the bones and came back when the body was weak. The scar across his face twitched as he spoke. You should have stayed out of it, Weller, he said, voice like sandpaper. You and that dog. You don't know what she saw. Jonas coughed, eyes narrowing. I know enough. Darcy took a step forward, boots creaking against the warped floorboards. You think it's about revenge? You think I came for you? No, I came for her. Freya was the only one who survived that night with eyes still open. She saw what happened in the outpost, the civilians, the fire. She was meant to disappear. She saved lives. She disobeyed orders. Darcy raised the gun. In the corner of the room, Freya lay still, breath shallow. The earlier attack had left her shaken, her ribs bruised, her muscles taut from days of exhaustion. But her ears never stopped listening. Even now, blind and battered, she listened. To the wind outside, to Jonas's heartbeat, to Darcy's footsteps and the metallic weight of his weapon. She heard the trigger tighten, and then she moved. It happened faster than thought. One moment she lay still. The next, her body launched from the dark like a living missile, guided not by sight, but by the pure instinct of a protector. Darcy fired. The The shot cracked through the silence, ricocheting off the cabin walls. Jonas saw it all in slow motion. Freya's body hit the air, her snarl echoing like a war cry, and the bullet tore through her chest, sending her tumbling midair. But even wounded, she didn't fall away. She fell forward, onto Darcy. The two of them crashed to the floor. Freya's jaws clamped down, not with rage, but with resolve. It was her final command. Protect. Jonas didn't hesitate. Through the blur of pain, he raised his weapon and fired twice. The first shot hit Darcy in the stomach. The second found his chest. The man gasped, a broken sound, and fell still. The silence that followed was enormous. Jonas crawled forward, dragging himself toward the tangled bodies. Darcy didn't move. Freya was still breathing, barely. He cradled her head in his lap, his blood mixing with hers on the wooden floor. Her breath hitched, then steadied. One ear flicked faintly, responding to the sound of his voice. "It's okay," Jonas whispered. "I'm here." She didn't move. Her eyes, those blind, milky eyes, seemed to stare through him into something deeper. And then faintly came the sound of paws. Small ones. The pups had followed them. Nova was the first to arrive, yipping as she darted through the broken cabin door, her fluffy tail high, sniffing the air. Then came Echo and Lumen, followed by Dusk. Flint was last, his tiny legs barely managing the uneven ground. They circled Freya, nuzzling her, whining. Jonas watched as her ears lifted again, barely, but they lifted. She knew they were there. She waited for them, Jonas murmured. She waited until they were safe. The tears came slowly, unfamiliar and reluctant. Jonas hadn't cried in years. Not when Elise died. Not during war. Not when his body broke, or when the nightmares made him dig his nails into his palms at night. But now, watching the dog who saved him, who saved them all, lay dying in his arms, he wept. Freya's body was limp, but her head was warm. Her breath shallow. She didn't struggle. She just stayed. Mason arrived minutes later, having tracked the shots. He burst through the door, gun raised, eyes scanning. When he saw Jonas and the pups, his shoulders dropped. He crossed the room and knelt beside them. "Is she—" "She saved us," Jonas said. Mason didn't speak. He just placed a hand gently on Freya's side and closed his eyes. He had known her only a short while, but even he understood. She wasn't just a dog. She was the last witness to a truth no one wanted remembered. That night, they carried Freya home. Jonas laid her in the garden beneath the sugar maple, the one Elise had planted long ago. Snowflakes drifted down around them, melting into the soil. Sarah arrived just before midnight. Her face was tight, pale under the porch light. She crouched beside Freya's resting place, one hand stroking the fur behind her ears. Her fingers trembled. "She fought to the end?" she asked. Jonas nodded. "She never stopped." Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she said softly, "Dogs know. Even when we don't, they know who we are and who we can be." Jonas didn't answer. He couldn't. Later, after Sarah had gone and the pups were asleep by the fire, Jonas sat with his journal. Day 27. Freya's gone, but not really. She left something behind in each of them. In Nova's courage, Echo's eyes, Flint's stubbornness. She gave everything. She never needed sight to see what mattered. She only needed heart. He stared at the last line for a while, then added one more. Why Columbus? Why this house, this city, this life? Maybe because this is where ghosts go when they want to be remembered, not feared. He closed the journal. Outside, the wind blew gently through the trees, and under the soft snow, beneath the roots of the old maple, the warrior rested. Finally, peacefully. She had done her duty. She had come home. Spring arrived in Columbus with the soft stubbornness of memory. The snow melted gradually, surrendering its grip on the backyard where the sugar maple stood tall, its branches just beginning to bud again. Beneath it, where the earth had been turned with reverent care, lay Freya. Jonas had placed a simple stone there, not marble, not carved, just a rounded river rock, smoothed by time, painted with 5 tiny paw prints, and one larger than the rest. Below it, in Jonas's careful hand-painted lettering, were the words, Guardian, Mother, Warrior. He often found himself drawn to the spot, especially in the early mornings. He'd sit on the bench he'd built from reclaimed oak, the same wood Elise had once picked out for their never-completed garden deck, and sip coffee while the world woke slowly around him. The pups, no longer tiny, not yet grown, bounded through the dew-soaked grass, their joyful energy punctuated by yelps and tumbled chases. Nova was the fastest. Sleek and lean, she had inherited Freya's awareness, always alert, always watching. Echo was more cautious, thoughtful in his movements, often trailing behind as if considering every path. Dusk remained the quiet one, often sleeping near the stone marker, his head resting in the grass. Lumen had turned into an explorer, digging through corners of the yard and returning with twigs like trophies. Flint, ever the smallest, had developed a stubborn streak, refusing to be left behind, even if it meant launching himself into puddles twice his size. Jonas worked with them daily. Short lessons, clicker training, gentle correction. It was Nova who took to structure best. She responded quickly, intuitively. Within weeks, she could respond to directional cues, follow hand signs, and stay focused despite distraction. Jonas saw potential in her. Something more than just obedience. She had presence. It was Sarah who first suggested he enroll Nova in a guide dog program. "You're halfway there already," she'd said one afternoon, as they watched Nova heel perfectly at Jonas's side. Sarah, dressed in her usual olive cargo vest and faded jeans, sipped unsweetened iced tea from a mason jar. Her hair was tied up messily, her eyes hidden behind prescription sunglasses that made her look tougher than she felt. Her tall frame leaned easily against the porch railing, but there was a new softness to her posture, something that had begun to emerge after Freya's death. Less guarded, less alone. She continued, "There's a retirement home west of the city. They're starting a program pairing trained dogs with visually impaired residents. She'd make a hell of a companion." Jonas nodded. "I was thinking the same." He filled out the forms a week later. As Nova began her official training, the house grew a little quieter. The other pups still romped through the yard, still knocked over water bowls and chewed up porch pillows, but something had shifted. There was purpose now, a forward motion Jonas hadn't felt in years. He'd begun renovating the old garage into a small writing room. Less tools, more light. Elise had once called it his someday space. Now, it had become his today. He started writing about Freya, not a memoir exactly, more like a tribute, a slender personal book told in simple prose for the people who had known animals like her, or who wished they had. It was part story, part journal, and part reflection on war, grief, and grace. He titled it, "Eyes That Never Blinked, The Story of Freya." The first chapter described that winter night when he found her in the snow. The final one was written 2 months after her death. "She never saw my face, but somehow she knew me, saw me, past the uniform, past the grief, past the shell. Freya didn't need eyes. She had something sharper, faith. In the end, I was the blind one, and she guided me home." The book was published quietly, small batch, locally printed, distributed mostly by hand. Sarah helped him place copies in vet clinics and shelters. Mason, back on the move again with whatever quiet jobs ex-soldiers did, left a copy on the desk of a commanding officer who'd once authorized a certain outpost to be erased from record. Jonas didn't care about sales. He cared about memory, about names not being forgotten. On a warm April morning, Jonas visited the retirement home where Nova had been placed. He hadn't seen her in 3 weeks. When he arrived, she came sprinting down the hallway, all legs and muscle, tail wagging wildly, before stopping in front of him and sitting perfectly still, waiting for the command she knew would come. "Come," he said gently. She leapt into his arms. The woman she'd been paired with followed close behind. Mrs. Edith Maynard, 79 years old, blind in both eyes from degenerative disease, but sharp as a tack, and opinionated in the best possible way. She wore a cardigan filled with brooches and a wide straw hat with an absurdly large flower pinned to it. "She listens better than my grandchildren," Edith said, chuckling, "and she doesn't argue politics." Jonas smiled. She had a good teacher. He stayed for tea. Edith talked about the books she listened to, about her late husband, about the time she met Frank Sinatra and almost fainted. When Jonas left, Nova didn't whine. She returned to Edith's side, lay down with her head on the woman's slipper. Driving home, Jonas passed the old railroad crossing near Westerville. The street sign flickered in the afternoon heat, RG Lawn Ave. He slowed the truck, RGLA. The letters etched inside Freya's harness came back like a whisper, C72 RGLA. Jonas pulled over, turned off the engine. It wasn't a military code at all. It was a location. A tiny maintenance depot near the Columbus rail yard. Years ago, before the outpost was closed, it had been used for temporary K-9 transfer between bases and civilian facilities. That's how she ended up here. It hadn't been random. She'd been sent to Columbus, forgotten, left behind in a city that had no reason to remember her, except he had found her. He stayed in the truck a long time. That night, back home, he sat beneath the sugar maple, the stone at his feet cool under his fingers. The pups, now nearly full-grown, lay scattered across the lawn, breathing softly in the twilight. A firefly flickered near Flint's ear, and he snapped at it half-heartedly. Jonas opened his journal. Day 78. She's gone, but she's everywhere. In Nova's calm, in Echo's silence, in the way the wind moves through this yard, carrying things I didn't know I still needed to feel. People ask me why I stayed in Columbus. Why here, of all places? I don't know. Maybe because this is where the forgotten come to be remembered. Or maybe it's just where she waited for me. He closed the book. The tree swayed above him. The stars blinked to life, one by one. Jonas leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered softly. Freya didn't see a thing, but she saw me clearer than anyone ever did. Freya never saw with her eyes, but she saw in ways the world too often forgets. She saw goodness where others saw brokenness. She trusted when she had every reason not to. She gave everything, not because she had to, but because her heart was bigger than her scars. And maybe, just maybe, Freya was a reminder that some angels don't come with wings. They come with fur, with 4 paws, and with a love so deep it can raise a wounded soul from the dark. Maybe God sent her not to be saved, but to save. Not just Jonas, but anyone who's ever felt forgotten. In our daily lives, we're surrounded by small miracles, unnoticed moments of grace, compassion, second chances. Maybe the cashier who smiled at you. Maybe the dog who waits at the window. Maybe that quiet voice inside that whispers, "Don't give up." If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone or some dog who saw you even when the world didn't, share it. Leave a comment. Tell us who your Freya was. Subscribe for more stories like this, of hope, loss, love, and redemption between animals and the hearts they heal. And tonight, before you sleep, say a quiet prayer, not just for Freya, but for all the forgotten souls still waiting to be seen. May God bless you. May He bless your home, your pets, your healing, and may you always have eyes that see, even when the world goes dark.